Want to crochet an easy pair of cozy boot cuffs? This pattern is for you. In this video, I'll show you 2 ways to make an easy pair of boot cuffs you can wear all fall and winter. Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and in this video I'm excited to show you 2 different ways to make some simple boot cuffs, both plain and with a kind of scalloped lacy edge along the top. So the first thing you'll need for this project is the free written pattern and instructions, which you can find at the link down below, or you can grab the ad-free PDF version in my shop at the second link in the description box down below. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you both exact instructions for this ribbed boot cuff and exact instructions for this scalloped edge boot cuff, as well as a method you can use to make your own custom fit boot cuffs with whatever yarn you like, so that you don't have to follow any exact pattern instructions if you don't want to. Now, boot cuffs are kind of like leg warmers or the upper portion of a sock, and they're usually worn around the top of your boot, but inside the boot. So if it's cold outside, they can help to keep cold air from seeping down into the sides of your boots. And if it's not cold outside, then they can also help to keep your boots from rubbing up against your leg if the top edge of the boot is kind of irritating and it rubs your leg. I have a pair of boots like that, so I am making some cozy boot cuffs to help keep the top of my boots from rubbing up against my legs. So I'm going to show you 2 different versions of a very, very simple boot cuff, but you can also customize this approach to make your own boot cuffs custom fit with whatever yarn you like, no matter what kind of gauge you're working with. So if you want to make a custom fit pair of boot cuffs with your own gauge, then first you'll need to measure around the circumference of your calf at whatever height you want to wear the boot cuffs. Now, if you're making boot cuffs for ankle boots or lower cut boots, then your boot cuffs will typically be a little bit smaller than if you're making them to go around the top edge of a boot that fits higher up the leg. Then you'll need to decide how high you want your boot cuffs to be. So the circumference of your calf at whatever height you want to wear the boot cuff is going to be the finished measurement that your boot cuff needs to comfortably stretch to. And you don't want to make the finished boot cuff the exact same measurement as your calf, because if you don't make it at least a little bit smaller than the calf measurement, then it will slide out of place too easily. You want it to stretch to comfortably fit, kind of like a snug fitting hat would. We're using a crocheted stitch that has a lot of give to it and a lot of stretch because it's a ribbed stitch. So this area is a little bit forgiving as far as getting the exact circumference just perfect. Next, you'll need to decide how tall you want your boot cuffs to be. Now, I prefer a height of about 4 to 6 inches. I tend to lean more towards around 6 inches because I really like the idea of being able to fold the boot cuff down over the outside of the boot. But you can choose whatever height you prefer. So I'm going to show you the basic techniques of how to crochet a very plain, simple, ribbed boot cuff. And you can either match the gauge that I'm using and follow my instructions and numbers and everything exactly, or you can make it kind of custom, use whatever yarn you want at whatever gauge you want, and just use these instructions as a guidelines. So first up, you're going to need some yarn. I recommend using a soft yarn, especially if there's a possibility that you might wear the boot cuffs up against the skin rather than like over your pants or something like that. Because if it's not soft against the skin, then it's not going to be comfortable to wear. So I'm making my boot cuffs for ankle boots, and they may sometimes be worn against the skin. So I am using 2 different yarns here. I'm going to be making a plain ribbed boot cuff, as well as a boot cuff with a kind of scalloped edge to it. It looks a little bit like lace, but it's very simple to make. So these yarns right here are both in the number 3 light or DK weight category, but one of them is definitely thicker than the other. So we're working with a little bit different gauge for each yarn. This one is Ice Yarns Cotton Bamboo Light, and this is 60% bamboo, 40% cotton. This one is Laurel Hill Variations DK, which is a little bit thinner, and this is a superwash merino wool. So if you're making your own custom boot cuff, pick whatever yarn you want. Use any yarn that you have in your stash that's soft, in a good color that matches whatever you want to wear them with. But I would recommend avoiding the super thick yarns for this, because for example, if you use a super bulky yarn, it's going to have a hard time fitting into the sides of your boots if you wear more fitted boots. So I would stick with category 5, which is bulky and thinner. You'll also need a crochet hook in a size appropriate for your yarn. I have a size H crochet hook for this yarn and a size G+, which is one size smaller, for this yarn. You'll also need some scissors, a measuring tape, and some yarn needles or a yarn needle to sew up your piece when it's finished. So let's get started with the crochet. Alright, so let's start with the plain ribbed boot cuff. So first you'll want to leave a tail at least 6 inches long and make your slip knot. And then you're going to chain 31. Now again, if you are following these numbers exactly, you'll want to make sure you check your gauge and match the pattern gauge. Use whatever hook size gets you the correct gauge for the pattern. Alright, so I now have 31 chain stitches. I'm going to skip the first chain from the hook, and I'm going to single crochet in the second chain from the hook and in each chain stitch across. Alright, so I've single crocheted in each chain stitch across, and that's the end of row 1. You should now have 30 stitches, not including the chain that we skipped at the beginning of the row. So for row 2, we're going to chain 1 and turn the work, and we're basically going to be working rows of back loop only single crochet to make our ribbed fabric. So I've chained 1, I'm going to single crochet in the back loop only of the same stitch that my chain is coming from, and each stitch across. We're working in the back loop only of every stitch. In the back loop, if you're not familiar with that term, I have an entire video on that I will link down below. But the back loop, if you look at the sideways V shape that makes up the top of the stitch, working into the back loop, normally we would insert into both of them like this. And you see there's 2 strands there. Working into the back loop means that we're only going to insert our hook under the back one, or the one that is further away from us. Alright, so I'm almost down to the end of my row. And when you get to the end of the row, we are not going to be working into the top of the chain 1 that we skipped at the beginning of the row below. So we've single crocheted in the back loop only of each stitch across, and we should now have 30 single crochet stitches, not including the chain 1 at the beginning of the row. So you're going to continue repeating row 2 over and over and over and over and over again until you have the total number of rows according to the written pattern. That is only if you are matching the pattern gauge and following the pattern instructions exactly. But if you are making your own custom version, then you will go ahead and continue repeating row 2 until your entire piece is long enough this way, not this way. This is the height of our boot cuff. You want to continue repeating row 2 until your piece from bottom to top is the length that you need to wrap around your calf wherever you want the boot cuff to sit, and it should stretch a little bit. It should have to stretch a little bit to do that. Like I said earlier, if the finished piece is the exact same length as the calf circumference, then it won't stay in place very well. So it should be at least an inch, maybe 2 inches shorter than the entire calf circumference. So go ahead and repeat row 2 however many times you need, and then I'll show you what to do next. Alright, so I have finished repeating, working the same row again and again until I have the correct number of total rows in my piece for the size that I'm making. And the next step is to tie off and finish off our crocheted rectangle here. So first you're going to need to cut the yarn, and we want to leave a tail that is plenty long enough to seam this end of our rectangle to the other end. So I've got a tail that's about 18, 20 plus inches long, and I'm going to tie off my work like so. And the next step is to block our rectangle. So of course you're going to want to make 2 of these, one for each foot, but the next step is blocking. Now, I highly recommend blocking this project. If you're not familiar with blocking, blocking is a technique that almost every project needs before it is totally finished. And blocking helps to relax the fabric, even out the stitches a little bit, and helps make sure that your piece finishes at just the right size. It also improves the qualities of the fabric and helps it be more pliable, and just in general improves the overall look and feel of your finished item. So I have an entire video on blocking if you're not familiar with that technique, but what you can do is, depending on your fiber content, you can block with the method of your choice. So if you're using a synthetic yarn like acrylic, you might want to steam block your piece by pinning it out onto your ironing board or a couple layers of thick towels, and then holding a steaming iron about 2 inches above the surface of your work, but never letting the iron touch the actual crochet. And then you would let it cool, unpin it, and then continue on with the project. If you're using a natural fiber yarn, you might prefer to wet block your piece, and that's what I'm going to do. To wet block, you'll just need to get your piece very wet, saturate it with water, and then squeeze out the extra water so that it's not drippy or soppy. You want to gently squeeze out as much as you can. So you may want to lay it in a towel and roll it up and squeeze it really good to get any extra water out. And then you would pin it out to the correct finish measurements on blocking mats or thick towels. And blocking mats are just kind of a big foam mat that you can poke pins into for your projects. So you would pin it out onto your blocking mats or several layers of thick towels, and then let it dry completely before unpinning it. And that is how I typically block natural fiber projects. So you'll want to block both of your rectangles with the method of choice, and then we will go ahead and seam our boot cuffs together. Alright, so I have blocked both of my rectangles for my boot cuffs here, and we're ready to sew them together. So first you're going to need a yarn needle or a blunt tapestry needle. I like the ones with the bent tip because I think it makes it easier to poke the needle into the stitches. But if you only have straight ones, that's fine. If you only have plastic yarn needles, that's okay too. But I really like the metal ones because they don't break. So what we're going to do is we're going to take each rectangle, and we're going to lay it out in front of us here. On this side, I have the foundation chain edge of my work with the tail that we started with. And on this side, I have the top of the last row of stitches on this edge. And this is our long yarn tail that we left when we finished our rectangle. So all we're going to do is bring the short edges of our piece together like this. And we're going to take the long end of our yarn and sew these 2 edges together. So I'm actually going to turn mine around like this so that the long yarn tail is closer to me. And I'm going to thread that long yarn tail into my yarn needle. And basically we're just going to stitch the 2 edges together. Now, I like to use a specific version, I guess, of the whip stitch. If you're familiar with whip stitch, that means we poke the needle down on the one edge, up in the other edge, and then pull it all the way through, down in this side, up on this side, pull it all the way through. But I'm going to modify that a little bit. And that's because we're working in the back loop only in our crochet. So instead of, if you can see, this is the back of my first row with the foundation edge. And this here is the top of my last row, which is the front of the last row of single crochet. So to keep from interrupting the pattern of our back loop only single crochet ribbing, of course you can do a regular whip stitch and it won't be a big noticeable, weird looking thing on the back of your piece. The seam will not be obvious with a regular whip stitch, but it does look better, in my opinion, to seam it in such a way where the back loop only pattern, the ribbing, is not interrupted. So all I've done here is I've come up through the very, very corner of the foundation edge. So I'm going to come and pick up the front loop only. If you can see right here, this last row is the front of the last row of single crochet. So I'm picking up only the front strand of the top of that stitch, and then I will also poke through the foundation chain edge on the other side. So I'm going down and then up and pulling it through. And then I'm going to come to the next stitch and pick up only the front strand of the stitch, and then I'm going to pick up only the foundation chain part of the foundation edge on the other side. So again, I'm coming back to the top edge, pick up only the front strand on the last row of single crochet, and then I'm coming up through the next stitch in the chain on the foundation edge. And I'm going to go ahead and keep doing this for a few more stitches so that then I can turn it over and you can see what it looks like on the other side. And the reason that I'm choosing to do it this way is because if you decide to turn your boot cuffs down or fold them down over the top of your boots, then the seam will not interrupt the ribbing at all. So if we look at this side, the way our seam is looking so far on this side, although this row does look a little bit wider, it does not look like it's really interrupting the ribbing. But when we turn it over this way, the fact that we are not picking up both strands, if you flip this over, this right here is the top row of the single crochet, right here. So by only picking up what shows up as the front strand of the stitch on this side, we're leaving the other strand free on the other side, so that it leaves this additional ridge of the back loop only single crochet. So I'm just going to continue working this seam, going down through the front strand only of the last row of single crochet, and then coming up through only the chain stitch on the foundation edge, and then pulling the yarn through, coming down through the front strand only of the single crochet, and then up through the next chain stitch on the foundation edge and pulling it through. And I'm going to keep doing that all the way across until I get to the end of my seam. Alright, so I've made it all the way to the end of my seam, and I have a little tube here of crochet. And now that I'm at the other end, you can see we have the tail that I've been seaming with and the other tail. That's from our beginning of our piece. So we can go ahead and just tie those two together in a double knot. And if you tie your double knot nice and close to the edge of the work, it will kind of just disappear into the fabric. And our final step is to weave in our yarn tails. So you can either weave them into the seam or into the rows of the stitches. So if I come through here, I can pick up under my needle the strands of the back of this row of stitches, where that the bottoms of the stitches are going into the top of the row below. And with my needle, I'm just kind of following where kind of the inside of each stitch across the row is. And I can go ahead and do that for several inches. You don't just want to do this for 2 inches and then stop, because you don't want it to wiggle out. So it's a good idea to go ahead and do it for a few inches and then turn around and then go back the other direction on another row. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. You want to give your piece a good stretch so that you don't have your yarn pulling too tight. And then I'm going to bring my needle down into the row below and run my needle through the middle of the stitches in that row as well. Alright, so I'm almost back to the edge. I don't have to be all the way to the edge. I'm just going to go ahead and pull it through, give my piece a little bit of a stretch so that the yarn isn't pulling too tight. And then I can trim the extra length with my scissors. So now I'm going to do the same thing with the other yarn tail and weave it in as well. This one I'm going to go ahead and weave into the seam. So in this case, I will be kind of following the whip stitches of the seam, which is actually a little bit more difficult to do because they're tighter. So if you've tightened your stitches in your seam pretty well, then it'll be a little more difficult to get the needle through there, but that's actually not a bad thing because then the yarn will have a much harder time wiggling its way out. But regardless of how you choose to weave in your ends, you just want to make sure that they are securely woven into the fabric and that they're woven in far enough that they won't wiggle their way out. All right, so I've gone ahead and woven my tail in this way, and then I've come to another row and woven it in back this direction. So now I can go ahead and trim the yarn tail. So that is a finished boot cuff, and you'll want to repeat those instructions, the seaming instructions, to finish your second boot cuff. But you can see how that because of the way we seamed it, our seam is basically reversible. So if you want to turn the top of your cuff down, there's no obvious seam line there. Alright, so now I'm going to show you how to make the exact same style of boot cuff, but with a scalloped edge to it. So if you're customizing your own boot cuff with whatever yarn you have, you can also use this technique, but like I said, if you are following the pattern instructions that are written exactly, then you'll definitely need to check your gauge and use the yarn and hook that will get you the same gauge that the pattern calls for. So I am going to start with my hook, my H hook, and my DK weight yarn, and I'm going to chain 25. Alright, so I now have 25 chain stitches, and now I'm going to skip the first chain and single crochet in the second chain from the hook. And then I'm going to single crochet in each chain stitch across. Alright, so I'm down to the end of my chain, and I should now have 24 single crochet stitches, not including the chain that we skipped at the beginning of the row. So now let's move on to row 2, and this is where we add that scalloped edging. So normally we would chain 1 to start our row, but for that scalloped edging we're going to chain 3, and then turn the work, and then we're going to skip the first 2 chain stitches and slip stitch in the third chain. So we made 3 chains, we're going to skip this one, and then slip stitch in the third chain, like so. Then we're going to single crochet in the back loop only of the same stitch that our chain was coming from, like so. We're not skipping any of the actual single crochets from the previous row. And we're going to single crochet in the back loop only of each stitch across. Alright, so I'm down to my last stitch there. We're not working into the top of this chain that was skipped from the row below. And that's the end of row 2. But we don't need a scalloped edge at the bottom of our boot cuff. We only need it on the one edge because that's going to be the top. So for row 3, we're only going to chain 1 as normal, and then single crochet in the back loop only of the same stitch your chain was coming from, single crochet in the back loop only of each stitch across. Alright, so I'm almost to the end of my row, and I am only going to single crochet in the back loop only of the last single crochet from the row below, because we want to leave our little loop that we made alone. We're not going to work into that at all, because that is supposed to stick out and be loose and separate so that it can make our little scalloped edge. So you should again have 24 single crochet stitches, not including the chain 1 from the beginning of the row. And now what you're going to do is keep repeating rows 2 and 3 until your piece is long enough from top to bottom. So not this way. This is the height of our boot cuff. This is going to be the circumference of our boot cuff. So keep repeating rows 2 and 3 until your piece is long enough to comfortably wrap around the calf at the height that you want to wear your boot cuff. And like I said, it should stretch a little bit to do that. Or if you're following the pattern instructions exactly, then the pattern will tell you exactly how many rows you should have. So when I say repeat rows 2 and 3, that means we're going to repeat row 2, then repeat row 3, then repeat row 2, then repeat row 3, and alternate that pair, working that pair of rows over and over and over again. So to start working row 2, I'm going to go ahead and chain 3 again, turn the work, skip the first 2 chains and slip stitch in the 3rd chain from the hook, and then single crochet in the back loop only of each single crochet across my row. And just for demonstration, you can kind of see how our little scalloped edge is already forming. All right, so I finished repeating those 2 rows in my scalloped edge version of the boot cuff. And when you finish your rows, you want to finish by working your last row as row 2. And by doing that, that will make our rows line up correctly when we put the ends together, so that there won't be a gap in between the first little picot along the edge and the last one. So you'll want to go ahead and cut your yarn once you have worked the correct number of rows total for the size you're making, ending with row 2. And you want to leave a good long yarn tail. This is probably about 18-20 inches long. And then you can go ahead and tie off. So that is our finished piece. And you'll want to repeat the same instructions for your second boot cuff to crochet the other rectangle. So once you've crocheted both of your rectangles for your boot cuff, the next step is blocking. I described how you would go about blocking your boot cuffs earlier in the video, so go back and watch that when I showed how to block the orange ones without the scalloped edge. But you'll want to go ahead and use the blocking method of your choice to block your rectangles, and then we'll be ready for the seaming. Alright, so I've blocked both of my rectangles here, and now I'm ready to sew them together. So you'll need some scissors and a yarn needle of your choice. I like the metal ones. So I'm going to go ahead and use this one. And let's just do one at a time here. So if you look at your piece, you'll have at the beginning a shorter yarn tail where this is our foundation chain edge, and we started with about a 6 to 8 inch yarn tail, and then at the other end we have a longer yarn tail, and this is our 18 to 20 inch yarn tail that we've reserved for seaming. So I'm going to thread the long yarn tail into my yarn needle, and we're ready to sew this together. So first we're going to take the 2 short ends of our rectangle and bring them to the middle, bring them together like so. And what we're going to do is seam these together. I'm actually going to flip mine over and then bring the ends together this way so that the last row of single crochet where my long yarn tail is attached is facing me as the front of that last row. And I'm also seeing the back of our first row where the foundation edge is. And we're going to seam this the same way that we did the other boot cuff by whip stitching our edges together through the front loop only of the single crochets on our last row of stitches. So as I did before, I'm going to go ahead and pick up only the front strand of the single crochets along the last row and go through the foundation chain edge of the foundation chain along our first row. So I'm going to come to the next single crochet on the last row and pick up only the front strand, and then I'm only going to poke my needle through the next foundation chain on the foundation edge and then pull it through. It might get caught sometimes. That's okay. Then I'm going to come back over here, and when you whip stitch, you're always going to be stitching in the same direction. So I'm going to pick up the front strand only of the single crochet, the next single crochet on the last row, and then pick up the chain stitch, the next chain stitch along the foundation edge. And I'm going to do this all the way across until I get to the other end of my seam, picking up only the front strand of the single crochet and the next chain stitch along the foundation edge each time. Alright, so I'm almost to the end here, and we want to take note of the fact that our very last, the end of our edge here is going to look like it goes further than it does because we have this picot here. I'm only going to pick up the last single crochet with the last foundation chain from the foundation edge and leave this picot untouched. We're not seaming through this at all. We want it to be able to kind of hang freely with the rest of them. So now that I've made it to the other edge, what I can do is go ahead and tie my seaming tail together with my original yarn tail in a very tight and close to the edge of the work double knot. And then we can weave in our yarn tails the same way that I showed you to weave them in for the other boot cuff. Alright, so now that our boot cuffs are seamed together and we have all the tails woven in, now they are finished. So now you have a cozy pair of boot cuffs that you can wear with whatever boots you like all fall and winter. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to leave it a like and subscribe to my channel for more videos just like this one. Thanks for watching.